Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's Meet a Poet. My name is Sophia Hall. I'm a poet myself from Washington, D.C., and I served as Youth Poet Laureate of D.C. in 2023. I'm a student at the University of Pennsylvania, where I study English and creative writing. Today, I'm delighted to introduce our Meet a Poet, Bella Rotker. Bella Rotker is a proud Miami local by way of Venezuela. A 5-time YoungArts winner and Best of the Net nominee, she has had work in Slow Flow Pojo, Fifth Wheel Press, Jake, and she was in Best American High School Writing for 4 years in a row. When she's not writing or making shadow puppets, Bella is always thinking about cafecitos and bodies of water. She recently graduated from the creative writing program at Interlochen Arts Academy in Michigan, and she will be attending the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill in the fall. Thanks so much for joining us today. I'm so excited to hear your poems. After the reading, we'll have a brief Q&A session, so if you have any questions, feel free to put them in the chat. Now I'm going to turn it over to Bella.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for having me, and thank you for that glowing introduction, Sophia. It's always a joy to be here with you. Hi, I'm Bella. I'm zooming in, or I guess streaming in from Miami, and I guess I'll just hop right in and read some poems. If you have any questions, feel free to leave them in the chat. I can stop and explain anything as I go on if there's anything confusing. And I think that we'll have a Q&A session at the end, so I'm very excited. This first poem is called Pastoral Poem, and it was one of the first ones that I wrote when I graduated from Michigan and came home, or I guess the first year that I came home from Michigan before I graduated. And I was really thinking about the cultural differences between one side of the country and the other, and learning how to grapple with that and how to continually introduce myself to different groups of people. So I thought it would be a good one to start off. It's called Pastoral Poem. I drove hours in hopes of finding blank pastures, of watching their emptiness work their way down my arms as I dug. I told my friends I've stopped writing, consulted futures with brujas who told me to breathe like this. How Homestead is the only part of Miami zoned for animals, but its main export is farmers markets and squash. Dirt roads, so endless. I almost want some other pastoral to explain myself into. Like, did you know the Ohio River Valley never really dried up? Not losing my Miami, but I've made a mistake. Not oceans full of bodies, but thick pines fading into Lake Michigan. Not exile, but the emptiness that only comes after rain pummels itself into farmland. After a bruja told me to scoop my insides out and leave myself to dry by the shore, I did. I tried. Everything was bright and golden, so beautiful. How the Spanish word for peacock is royal turkey. Everything perfect, shifted just out of place. And a bruja is a sort of witch in Latin American culture, and they're really big in Miami. So a lot of people, like, it's kind of become part of the lore of the place, you could say. Okay. This poem I wrote when I was living abroad in Venezuela, and I was doing work at a nonprofit. I was thinking a lot about birds because I was spending almost all of my days sort of out on the balcony or by the window of my office, looking out at the birds on the trees. This is called Your Father Never Wrote the Pantoum He Kept Telling Us About. And a pantoum is a form of poetry where certain lines or images repeat over and over again. So you'll see things sort of come back and circle. Your father never wrote the pantoum he kept telling us about. The shoes set out to dry on the balcony, bleaching in the sun. What you thought was a fallen egg was really the body of a dove wrapped up in palm fronds. You wanted to sing to it, but I said it couldn't hear you, not the bird you thought it was, anyway. And by the time we got downstairs, the neighborhood boys were already lifting it with a still green palm frond. No singing, just silence as they moved it, carefully, like a machine. I didn't ask the boys their names, where they were taking it. There was nothing I could do about your father, who this morning we found dead. The laundry he put in the machine, still running. The coffee rings on the table. The EMTs asked why we came by the house. There is nothing we can say that will explain it, they said. No faces of mourning, just a bad feeling. This was a man they did not know. No signs of life, but the coffee still brewing, the unanswered calls. So I did not ask the boys if they were going to bury the bird or simply wanted it off the sidewalk. What games they were playing in the early morning, I did not want to know. People die all the time, you said. The notebook flipped open to a Thanksgiving toast. The Times open to the crossword, and on the other page, a headline. There are new ones all the time. It's so hard to keep track, we'd say, because what else is there to say? The sunflowers on the coffee table are still yellow. Your father's shoes sitting in the sun. On the balcony, I brought you last night's coffee, which you poured out, not because you loved him, but because the plants were dry. Thank you. This is Wildness. This was, again, a poem I wrote about coming to Michigan and having to figure out how to grapple with my cultural identity in a completely different place where, the way that the people interact with each other and with themselves and the world is super different than what I grew up with. So this is Wildness. I wanted to escape myself. My fault, I guess. Went north, too far into the pine woods. If I could forget the sound of water lapping against the seawalls, I think I would. If I knew then what I was leaving, I still would have done it. Now, though, I spend most days telling my mother I'm sorry, picking pebbles out of the creek. When the rain comes, I lay in it. I let it pummel me into gravel. I watch echoes of my hometown reverberate through the shell of my body. I say that I'll stop being homesick when the sky opens up again, when I see something beautiful inside it. Everything here is so empty. What grows in the river, I can catch in my hands. I miss being small. Scales slipping through my small fingers, trawl nets washed into huge webs on the sand. I want back the salt, the way it stings my ankles when I stand at the edge of something shapeless, swarming minnows. I want to hang the stars up the way they look at me from the edge of the ocean, like slack mouths of fish as they're reeled into the side of the boat, the way a paring knife knows its way between gills. I want to remember what it's like to know the scale of things. Look, all I really wanted was for the gulls to be quiet for a day. I'm sorry for wanting it all back. Thank you. Okay, this is a funny little poem I wrote after a poet that I really admire, whose name is Dorothy Alasky. And the title is a line from her poem, The Dogs. It's called, You, My Horrible Star. You, my horrible star. The dogs retract, back paws, front feet into cages. Doors slam shut. The want follows them, and everything ceases. You're in the window, wanting immensely, even when it's all gone. In the window, you're a star. Townspeople look up at you from the cobblestone and wonder what you're doing in there. The shutters close. Even when obvious, you are the kind of thing that doesn't want to be found. We all desperately want to find you, to break paths into fur, to overflow, all hair, the thing in its teeth, synchronized. You split the dogs and their metal inside. Bolts tumble out like a corpse. When you whistle, we wait for the bone. So it's a funny little poem. This is called This Too Is Grief. The title was taken from a tweet back when X was called Twitter. And it is also a tweet by a poet. And I was thinking about sort of the way that it manifest, these feelings manifest for different people. So this too is grief. This too is grief. Dogs howling at the door, at nobody in the driveway, a package run over, it must have fallen out of the mail truck. My mother folding laundry and arguing with my father about God knows what this time I go for runs, because what else is there to do in a hometown except to run away from myself until I realize I'm not being chased, then sit in fields of poppies with my dream self who eats so much Cuban bread and is not sorry to be alive like real me was taught to. Real mother is kind but unforgiving, much like a metaphor about girlhood. And that's a sonnet, which I love sonnets. I write a lot of sonnets. So it's a little one about going for a walk in my neighborhood and thinking about Twitter. Okay. This is a poem that I wrote at the river that runs through this little creek that runs through the woods behind my boarding school in Michigan. And the Cuyahoga River is a really famous river fire that happened in Ohio. This is called "The Cuyahoga River Caught Fire at least 12 times." Lately, I've been thinking about wild animals. Weeds growing up the side of the highway guardrails, the patch of tulips outside the waste management facility. I watch my reflection shift in puddles of oil. After my first heartbreak, my mother drove me out to the Everglades in the middle of the night. The sky was pale gray and milky, and there my mother explained to me what light pollution was. She said girls love like wildfires, and boys were made to love how beautiful the heat is. That boys watch their reflection in shiny objects, flickering like candles. That they have to wait for heartbreak to make them human. I have to laugh because what else is there to say? Last week, my friend buried a bird in the yard and left a daisy on top. I smelled the rot of its body from the balcony. I watched the sky erase itself, clouds moving thick over our heads. In the aftermath, I fill my room with vines, real ones, and keep track of their decay. This is how I rewrite myself. In the mornings, I take walks by the creek and imagine myself as a slick of oil on the water. When I cut myself on the brush, copper wiring comes tumbling out of my ankles. My mother tells me that this is normal. I watch myself burn in the rear view. Thanks. This is a spring poem. I wrote this imaginably in the spring a couple years ago, and I kind of forgot that I wrote it. And when I was looking for poems to read for you guys, I was thinking about how I talk about the way that I experience the world and, my relationship to being an American and what that's like. And so I think that this is just a poem where I was really happy. And, I think it's kind of funny because there is a line that actually happened. I was really happy one day and a stranger came up to me and was like, "You look very sad." And I was like, "I'm not sad." So this is a spring poem. Longing is not abstraction, but a siren test. Today, I know the apricot blossoms like I know what it's like to fall. Purple skies and the clouds sinking into our sadness. I wake up devastated most mornings for the trees, ice crystals thawing in the early morning. I drove by your house and felt your ghosts hanging above the stucco. This isn't poetic. I write poems about salvation and pretend they're not really about you. I go for bike rides in miniskirts, trap flies under cups. I cover this hurt with a cute updo, some sunscreen. Explain wisteria to the grass. Today, I know the false security of poems recited under my breath, flowers pruned and arranged in jars. Today is not like yesterday. Today, I wake I take the dog on a walk, wear shorts for the first time since August. This isn't lost love, but the koi swimming in circles as soon as the pond thaws. All this thinking about loss wears on the body, this light undivided, incense ash crumbling as the wind creeps through the open window. I'm not sorry for how this happened, for what the women say while scrubbing pans. I wonder if this too is a siren test. Today, a stranger says they noticed a sadness about me and gave me the number of their therapist. I called my brujo instead and asked about you. He said something about false alarm. He had me light black candles. For now, I am sitting in the parking lot, watching flowers curl open and thinking about poems. For now, I am deciding not to love you. Thank you. Okay, I wrote this poem a while ago when there were wildfires that were sending a bunch of smoke into New York, where I was at the time. Thank you. Where I was at the time, and the sky just turned this horrible shade of black and orange. And so I was thinking about how do we live in this world where things are constantly changing. And I was traveling a lot at the time, and so I was in many different cities, trying to stay on one page in my life, and figuring out how to grapple with that. So this is Smoke Cities. Somewhere between all of these buildings, I'm waiting for this to become real, counting garbage bags and versions of us that could have ended in all this concrete fading into a sunset, the pigeons morphing into gulls, in which we write ourselves into existence. Your switchblade stuck into the tree between our two initials. There's a version of this where we're stuck here forever. I fly to this godforsaken city to find you and realize you're still in Boston. Between hometowns, we string ourselves apart like it'll save us. Dial tones, bookstores, brownstones. You met my roommate and called her the nickname I gave her. In another version of this, you hold me like my body is a permanent hometown. Versions of this colliding above us, all this nothingness, a god I am learning to surrender to. In another version of this, I tear myself open and bleed into the rug while my mother recites verses. They can see your nakedness. In this version, I sneak into a church and light a candle for both of us. Black scaffolding crashing down into the empty spaces between us and now. In another version of this, we pass through this life of casual violences like it means nothing. My body, a kind of cartography. The legacy poems embed into my skin as I read them and try again to cram myself inside their souls. Like a hometown, I come back to where I began. The return lands soft, like ash, like so much potential. Spray paint flowering across brick walls. Everything falls away when you get down to it. Underneath all this ash is a burning city. You and me on the edge of the bridge, watching the cement dissolve into the ink-dark sky. Thanks. This poem is called Shotgun. It started when I was talking to a friend of mine about dogs, and he said that his favorite dogs were this breed of racing dogs that are really sort of skinny, and I've always thought they were kind of freakish looking, but he really likes them. And I was thinking about what those dogs are and, what their life is like, sort of always racing, always searching for something that is just sort of inching ahead of them. This is called Shotgun. If I were a better poet, I'd have something profound to say about calculated loss, this predictable kind of exhaustion. I'd ask how true it is what they say about empires lasting 250 years, those 4 smokestacks, only one of which works. We discuss the possibilities. How bad, really, could this be? while the hot sky darkens. We've said the same for the last 4 generations, that constant leaving or being chased out, always in transit, always wanting more, past the rum. We put compa on the radio. No, there's nothing more we can do about sure decline, that deja vu. The broken leg, blood seeping through the muddy fur. On the near-melted asphalt, we are dogs, loose on God's narrow track. Juniper berries sink in sweating glasses, held by women wearing derby hats. Meanwhile, we run in circles through our pain. In the backstretch, there's that desire. I, too, will be free. Sticky sweat runs down the backs of our floral dresses, while the lure reels back. Greyhounds ready on their hawks, the jackpot on the ticket. We lean in, waiting for the gun to go off. So that's all I have for right now. Thank you guys so much. I've loved seeing all of your comments pop through.
Yay! It was so wonderful to hear you read your work aloud. I noticed a lot of themes of wildness, what it means to be maybe a wild girl, hometowns, whether they're physical or intangible or intrinsic to someone. I see questions in the chat already, which make me happy. Please keep them coming. I think in the poem you read just before this one, Smoke Cities, you talk about the legacy poets embed into my skin. So we have a question from Maya that kind of connects to that. What are your favorite poets that inspire you to create your own poems? And when you're writing, who do you write for? Do you have a special reader, or does the intended audience vary from poem to poem?
Wow, that's really good. Okay, there's so many really good questions. Where to start? So the legacy poets, I'll say, are sort of the last generation of contemporary poets that have really defined the way that young poets or newer poets interact with poetry and art and writing. And so because I was studying creative writing from one of these poets, actually, I was thinking a lot about what that means and what that legacy means, and how to live up to that. And so a lot of what I was reading was, poets like Ilya Kaminsky, Jericho Brown. I love Anne Carson. I read a lot of Anne Carson. Right now I'm reading Plain Water, which is about sort of various journeys that she takes, one of which being through Europe, which was really cool to see while I was traveling in Europe. So yeah, I just kind of read a lot. I read a lot of sort of smaller literary magazines that are produced by younger writers and people my age. And I find it really inspiring to see what other people are talking about and writing about and thinking about during this, sort of weird phase of late teens, early 20s, and figuring out how to interact with that as artists and, how to become sort of citizens of the world. So I guess in that sense, I don't write after specific poets as much as like whoever I've read recently that inspires me is kind of what's most recently on my mind. In terms of a reader, that's a really good question. I think I had a mentor a while back who always challenged me to make my poems more difficult for the reader, which is kind of counterintuitive. But I think what she was really getting at was learning that to be an artist, a citizen artist, which is sort of an artist that uses their work to interact with the world, to be a citizen artist, you kind of have to figure out how to make people connect with your writing. And so I don't write for a specific person as much as I write to understand myself and my place in the world so that other people can see that and think about me and my place in the world, but also themselves and their place in the world.
I think we were first introduced to each other by Richard Blanco, who is a poet from Miami, but he kind of splits his time between Maine and Miami. He even has a poem about that, and it's funny, like you also alliteratively split your time between Miami and Michigan. It's just fun. He has this great book that came out last year, which is kind of just like a compilation of his greatest hits called Homeland of My Body. A lot of your poems have this theme of hometown or homeland running through them. And I just wanted to ask you about how you navigate your relationship of trying to escape from yourself while also finding yourself, and if hometowns like help with that process at all, or if writing poems help with that process at all. Let me know if you want that question to be more concrete. It kind of is living in the abstract world right now, but hopefully you can answer that.
No, that's a great question. Yeah, I love Richard Blanco. He's a great poet. So I think that a really big part of sort of being a teenager and being in your early 20s is answering that question, right? Figuring out who you are and where you're from and what you believe. And so for me, it was kind of weird to do that, having moved around so much. My family is from Poland. I was born in Venezuela. I grew up in Miami, and then I went to school in Michigan, and now I'm moving to North Carolina. So I'm kind of from all over the place. And so it's funny because a lot of times when people introduce themselves to you, the first thing they say is their name, and then they say, "Where are you from?" Right? And so I always had trouble answering that question. I was like, well, where am I from? Because I'm from so many places. And growing up, I really didn't like Miami. I didn't like where I was living. And I think that moving away to a place that I had a really complicated relationship, more so than in Miami, really helped me figure out what that relationship is to my hometown and what identity I take from Miami. A lot of people, I think something that makes Miami really unique is that most people who live there aren't originally from there, myself included, right? It's a very Latino population, and that's something that makes it kind of different from the rest of America. And so I think that like something really special has been in the absence of that culture that I was so used to growing up. How do I explain myself and how do I understand who I am in the context of all of that, right? When I first moved to Michigan, people didn't know the difference between Venezuelans and Mexicans. People didn't know what a cafecito is, which is a great coffee, Cuban coffee that we all drink in Miami. Highly recommend trying it. People didn't know anything about my culture and where I was from and, you know, my position in the world and the way that the people around me have influenced the way that I, you know, interact with the world. And so I think that hometowns became really important to me after I moved because it was a lens through which I understood the world. And it was something that kind of came into focus, so to speak, after I moved away from it. And so, you know, I learned to appreciate things about the culture of where I was living there and also about where I come from and sort of that beautiful mixture of where I'm from, right? One example is I really love water. I did one of my graduation requirements from Interlochen was to write a long project. That was just kind of it, right? Come up with a long project, explore it for a semester. And so for me, that was water and sort of the way that culture forms around water. That's something that became really important to me after I moved away because Miami is a very coastal city. It's a big part of who we are. You know, we're known for our beaches. We're known for our ports. We're known for sort of all the things that the water indicates, right? And a lot of sort of legal policy that surrounds the water. And we have the Everglades, which is a hugely important natural resource. They call it the river of grass. So, you know, I grew up around water and then I came to Michigan, which is quite dry. And everybody was like, oh, Lake Michigan is kind of like an ocean. It looks just like an ocean. And I was like, no, it doesn't. I was like, have you seen an ocean? Have you been to the ocean? And a lot of people were like, no, I haven't. And that was a really foreign concept to me because I grew up walking distance from the ocean. And so there were just small things like that where I was like, wow, like our culture and the way that we grow up and where we grow up has a really big influence on the people that we become. And so I guess that's why I think a lot about hometowns and the things that I carry with me. And so in that sense, like my body is a hometown, right? The things that I carry with me are part of who I am. You know, I wear a lot of jewelry that is, you know, I pick up from my travels. I do my makeup like we do in Miami. There are just those small things that become really important to me that a lot of people are just like, oh, that's just kind of how she is. And I think that perspective has also given me a really strong appreciation of, other people also have those things, right? Like there are other parts of our stories that are not necessarily visible. And so I think that writing poetry and just kind of being a writer has helped me interact with that and understand that about other people.
I really enjoyed hearing about like your physical affinity with the ocean because there's just nothing that can replace like sea salt and the tides. I'm sure Lake Michigan is great and it's big for sure, but it's freshwater, and the ocean can also be your hometown, and that's kind of like the currents go everywhere, so it's cool. You're kind of a global citizen if you identify with the ocean. I think a lot of your poems are grounded in place, and you do that through mentioning the nature. So you talk about like the seawalls and the ocean when you're talking about Miami, but when we go up north, there are pine woods and then there's the lake. Do you feel like you physically identify with a lot of nature, and that's kind of how you navigate being in different places, is getting to know the nature?
Yeah, I think so.
Favorite tree or river, sorry, a favorite tree or river that you like to write about that's particularly inspiring?
Yeah, for sure. It's funny because as a kid, I never really thought of myself as a nature person. Like I didn't like hiking,
Mm.
I didn't like bugs, I didn't like mosquitoes. And so I kind of always associated nature with like camping. And, my brother was a Boy Scout. And so he was always outside and learning to be one with nature. And I was like, that sounds terrible. But there's also like kind of being a part of Miami, and this is also something that Richard Blanco writes about a lot as well, is like Miamians have a really strong cultural identity. We really love the place that we're from,
Mm-hmm.
because we also really love the places that we're originally from. And I think that something really special about Miami is the water and the way that we have formed around the water, but also like we have mangroves, which don't exist a lot of other places, and they are hugely protected, not just legally, but also culturally, right? We hate people who litter. We hate people who disrespect the mangroves because we understand the power that they have and the power that those sort of natural things interact with our city. And we really rely on nature to keep us alive because we're so coastal. And so moving from Miami to Michigan, I started to really notice, again, because my school was about 40 minutes into the woods. It was like in the middle of this big state park. And so we were always surrounded by these giant trees. And everybody was like, oh, like we have to protect the pines. And I was like, but the mangroves. Um, and so I would go to the river. I started going to this little creek that ran through campus, or, through the backside of campus. And I would just kind of sit there and try to identify things that reminded me of, the nature that I grew up caring about. And I realized that that is the natural world and that it's all so different and so beautiful. And that sort of became something important to me after I started to miss it.
Another aspect of the natural world that crops up in your poems are dogs, which I really enjoyed. Um, I I read this one anthology of poems called "A Dog Ran Through It," and it's just a book of poems all featuring dogs. And I felt like truly I could trace the dogs running through all of your poems, like kind of just like zigzagging across the page. So, what draws you to dogs? Using them maybe as symbols or just like writing about them in general?
Oh, that's a great question. I think that dogs have started appearing in my poems pretty recently. I didn't used to write about dogs very much, but now I do. I think part of that was my family has always had dogs. We are big dog people. We have boxers. Um, and we work with the local animal rescue. We love dogs. My mom is a huge dog person. And we had our dog recently died after I moved away. And so I was kind of learning to like grapple with sort of, again, the natural order of the world and the way that we all interact with it and the limited time that we have. But then I started to think about like dogs as an agent to other things, right? They're animals that really exist because we made them exist, right? Dogs are not something that sort of just popped up on the world like wolves or like lions or, any other type of similar animal. And so I think that I started to think about like that sense of cultural, impact that we have on the world and the way that dogs are an agent to what we want, and that they exist really to accompany us and sort of what that means for us as people.
And in your final poem, Shotgun, you kind of talk about the greyhound races, and they're supposed to be a companion, but then we also, the humans create these really inhumane conditions to race dogs. And that was kind of a metaphor for life, is like a greyhound race. Was my interpretation of that poem correct?
Yeah. I think, I do. I've always been sort of horrified by dog racing and those sort of similar things. And I think like a big part of my view of the world is the way that we interact with animals and with the world around us. I think that I personally feel a big responsibility to be kind to the world because it's given me so much and it's made me the person that I am. And so I'm always like sort of really disgusted when I see mistreatment of dogs and mistreatment of animals. And so, I was thinking about dog races and I was thinking about sort of the way that we inflict that on dogs, but also on ourselves, right? Like, my mom grew up around horses, and so she raised horses. And there's sort of a necessary violence in that, but there's also an unnecessary violence, and trying to tease out the difference between that, and the way that that reads over life and politics and just who we are in the world.
I can really tell your love for the natural world right from the beginning, from Pastoral Poem. And I wanted to highlight that title because it kind of indicates that you're writing in the tradition of pastoralism. Do you want to talk a little bit more about what pastoralism is and like explain the context of that poem?
Sure. I thought that would be an interesting poem to start with, again, because it was kind of thinking about the differences between Michigan and Miami, and that was sort of the beginning of my homesickness, so to speak. And I had been reading a lot of a poet whose name is Jacques Rancourt, and he talks a lot about like your identity as a pastoral. So like the person that you are and the way that you interact with the world and the sort of culture of that as its own land or its own dreamland, so to speak. And so I started to think about who am I as a landscape, right? And I grew up in a really kind of suburban area of a very big metropolitan city. But a lot of people don't realize that Miami actually does have farmland. It's called the Redlands, or it's called Homestead. Those parts are really agricultural, and they have horses and they have farms, and that's the only part of Miami that is zoned for that, which means it's the only part that's allowed to do that. And people don't know that, they hear Miami and they think nightlife, they think boats, they think, millionaires with their big houses. And I'm like, well, normal people live here too. And so I think like learning the differences between, identifying parts of my hometown that exist everywhere, right? There's farmland all over America and all over the world. And so kind of finding those similarities, right? There's a really important geographical feature of the Midwest, which is like that sort of area of the United States in which Michigan exists, is the Ohio River Valley, which is not just in Ohio. And the Ohio River was really important and really shaped the land and our culture. And so I just kind of was thinking a lot about, and I continue to think about, where does that all fall? Where does that all land? And what is our dependency on the history of where we live?
I love how your poetry is not only a portal to like your inner selfhood, but like transports all of us to think about the world and our place in it. one of the images in pastoral poem was really striking to me. It was after a bruja told me to scoop out my insides and leave myself to dry by the shore. I did. Oh, can you hear me now?
Yes, sorry.
Okay.
Okay.
Hi. I'm back. Sorry.
Yes.
Did you hear my question or do I need to start over?
I heard the first part of it.
Okay. It was just about the line in your poem about scooping out your insides and leaving yourself to dry by the shore. And I thought that was a really cool image of like gutting yourself like a fish. And it's kind of talking about necessary versus unnecessary violence. Earlier, there's this like tension of violence and beauty in self-preservation to like extract your internal part of yourself, and that's like a beautiful process, but it seems very painful, and like the metaphor itself is very violent, like it's splitting open a fish, splitting open yourself to literally preserve it. So
Yeah,
what can you speak to that tension?
for sure. Yeah, so like I said, brujas are really big in Latin culture. They're really controversial. And there's this one in a historic part of Miami that's called Colley Square that I went to. Just, I was in Colley Square and I was like, I'm gonna go see this lady and see what she says about my life. And they often are like, we'll say really sort of out of pocket and random things, and that are sometimes like kind of violent, right? Like they will light black candles and be like, this is the representation of how you will die. And I'm like, that's not what I wanted to know. And so, yeah, I was thinking about sort of the randomness of it all, and the way that that mysticism and Latin American mysticism interacts with nature. And a really big part of that is their relationship with life and death. And I think about how different that is from my relationship of life and death. And yeah, one of them did tell me to go and like lay on the shore and picture myself as like barren. And I was like, oh, okay, that's kind of weird. But I was thinking about like again, like how we treat the animals that live there, and we do that to fish, we do that to eels, we do that to all sorts of animals, and what that sort of emptiness is and what that means. And there's also like salt is a natural mineral that is known for preserving things, right? It dries it out, and it preserves things the way that they are. And so I was thinking about like, what would be preserved if I were to preserve my life or myself the way that I am in this moment? What would remain? So that's kind of where that image comes from.
Yeah, that's really beautiful. I also love the bilingualism in your poetry. You are like preserving your language, how you speak, the terms, the familiar terms you use in your poems, and the poems themselves are working as a living record. It's their external body of work that exists outside of yourself, and it preserves your girlhood, what your thoughts were like in your teenage years. And I think that's really, really lovely. We have a question from Victor in the chat that asks what your thoughts on AI generated or AI assisted poetry is. I have thoughts of my own, but I'm going to turn it over to you to see what you think.
Yeah, thanks for that question. I've gotten that a lot recently. And it's a question that sort of ignites like a primal reaction in me. I think that as humans, we have a really complicated relationship to AI, and we have a really complicated duty to ourselves in that. I don't personally use AI for writing. I think that it can be really helpful for doing things like writing an email that you don't want to write, or pulling together some articles so that you can do your own thinking. But I think it becomes a problem where a lot of people, especially in like American culture, in college and high school, people will use it in place of thinking. And I think that is really dangerous. I think that and it's not just like machines, I think it's when we choose to stop thinking or engaging with the world in a way that is unique to ourselves, I think that we can lose a bit of what makes us human. I think that our ability to think is what connects us to the natural world and what connects us to ourselves and to each other. And I don't know, I don't like the idea of losing that. I think that I saw a really wonderful quote somewhere about how people like, I want AI to do, not to do poetry and work and art so that I can do my dishes and clean my house. I want AI to clean my house and do my dishes so that I can do art and talk to people and interact with people, right? I want it to serve kind of the opposite purpose that people are using for now. And I think it's not just about, when people talk about AI in this context, they talk about, oh, artists losing their jobs or AI is coming for your life. And I think it's a more fundamental thing than just that. Because to me, art isn't a job. It's something that I do because it's what makes me human. It's something that, connects me to other people. That's what I do to be in my community, is make art. And I think that when we get to a place where AI is sort of separating us from each other and from ourselves, that can be really precarious. And I think it puts us in a place where we historically have not been before. So I guess my thoughts on AI are be mindful about what you're using it for, and be mindful that you're still able to think for yourself and interact with the world in a way that is honest and unique to you.
Yeah, I really resonate with your answer. I think what's special about your poems is that if I picked one up randomly off the street and it didn't have an author listed next to it and I had no idea about the context of the writer, I could still understand their feeling, and it would be their energy and their thoughts would be transferred to me. I think there's this really great Robert Frost quote that says, "No tears in the writer, no tears in the reader." So a lot of poems deal with pain or grief or happiness, like in that one poem when you talk about the stranger who came up to you and said you look sad, but you're like, actually, no, I'm very, very deeply joyful right now. If you put that feeling into a poem, the person reading it will just intrinsically understand. Whereas I feel like in an AI generated or assisted poem, you're kind of shortcutting to the solution and not putting in the work to get there. And then it's just missing an essential human quality.
Yeah, I agree. And I think that a big part of poetry is actually not the result. It's about the journey. I mean, not to sound cliche, but it's about like the process of making it. And so if there is no process of making it, then there's that question of like, is it still art? And like, what level of humanity has to exist in art for it to like be considered artistic and for it to be a part of human experience?
For some reason, that just sparked like the image of a Jackson Pollock painting in my head, just like the abstraction. And if you just saw a Jackson Pollock painting sitting in like a yard sale, like you might just think, oh, like someone just poured paint all over this canvas, or like a messy 5-year-old was scribbling and messy with their dinner one day. But like the process, the story of how he created it is what like makes it art and why people feel drawn to it. I have one or two more questions for you before the session wraps up. We've been talking a lot about your accomplishments as a writer, and you are just like so talented. You have so many poems that are beautiful and impactful. I want to know what the origins of Bella Rotker in poetry is. How did you get into creative writing?
That's such a funny question. I kind of fell sideways into creative writing. I grew up in Miami, which is a really big arts culture, right? Like that's something that's super important to who we are as a community. And so for me, it was always, and my mom is an art collector. And so for me, it was always sort of inherent. I was like, yeah, I do art. That's who I am, right? That's who Bella Rotker is she's someone who is an artist. But for the first 10 to 14 years of my life, that took the shape of dance. I was a classical dancer. I did the Russian technique. I was really intense about it, right? I was like, I'm gonna go to the Vaganova school. I'm going to, be a dancer, and that's who I am. And I was really obsessed with like the lineage of dancing and the sort of historical aspect of it. And so I applied to Interlochen for dance, and they said, actually, we want you to come for writing. I was like, oh, what? So I came to Interlochen. I was like, my thought was, at least this way I'll still be in a world of artists and I can still dance. And I got there, and it was unlike anything that I could have possibly imagined or was prepared for. And it just kind of took over my life in a really weird way, right? I was like, I came to understand dance as a part of my own lineage. And so I think about music and rhythm and sound. And, I think that a big part of who I am as a writer has to do with my history with dance, because I think a lot about the body. I think a lot about, the connection of the mind to the body and the way that we interact with the world, which is what dance is all about. And there's a sort of discipline to it, and there's a sort of history and a technique, and all of those things I think really geared me to become a writer in a really interesting way. And so I think, often people are like, oh, your writing is so musical or so sonic or, interesting in terms of the sound of the work. And I always thought it was funny, because when I was a dancer, that was my biggest weakness. I could never stay on count of music. I could never, hear the rhythm. I couldn't do any of that. And so I think it's funny to be in a position where that's kind of flipped. And I think that's something that continues to keep me interested in writing. And then from there, I became interested in writing as a way of activism and as a way of becoming part of my community.
Wow, I love how you have these dual and maybe even dueling mediums of artistic expression. I mean, I'm a very multidisciplinary writer. I write not just poetry, but scripts for the stage or for film. And I also write memoirs and short stories. And I think people also tell me, oh, wow, like I hear your voice in this poem. And I think writing dialogue for plays really helps me create a voice or a persona in different poems. And I love that those things go hand in hand.
Yeah, for sure. And I also, much like you, I don't just write poetry. I do a lot of script and nonfiction, and I think a lot about sort of, the way that dance has prepared me to interact with art, I think has had a really big influence on who I am as a writer.
Before I wrap up this session, I just want to ask if anybody wants to follow along with your work, where can they read more? Are there any publications, performances, or social media accounts that you want to share?
Sure. My website is bit.ly/Bella Rotker, capital B and R. So you can find me there, bit.ly/Bella Rotker. I'm also Bella Rotker on Instagram. I'm no longer on Twitter because I found it to be a terrible place. But I also work a lot with various advocacy organizations. I'm doing an event later this week with Ilya Kaminsky and Jericho Brown, which is like a dream come true. So if you wish to attend, you're more than invited to do so. And you can find the information for that on my social media or at on writersfordemocraticaction.org. And then, I guess I just kind of pop up in random publications. So I don't know where I'll be next. But I was recently in Welter, which is through the University of Baltimore. I was recently in the South Florida Poetry Journal, which was a dream publication for me. So shout out to Flo Pojo. Just lots of random publications like that. But you can find a collection of them on my website.
We were talking about hometowns earlier, and I think finding dream publications or finding a home for your poem just kind of like ties in perfectly for that, because now you're creating more hometowns, not just for yourself, but now you're like, your poems are residing in literal print and have ties and bonds of their own, which is really special. Overall, this Meet a Poet session has been really special. I think people are really inspired by your energy, your ties to the natural landscape, to your connection to your body and dance. Thank you so much for joining. I'm really happy that I could have moderated this session. To everyone, I hope you have a great rest of your day and you feel inspired and energized by Bella's vivacity. Thank you.
Thank you all so much. Thank you, Sophia. It's always a joy to do events with you. And thank you to all the people backstage who made this happen, and to the American Center in Moscow. So many thanks to everyone. And of course, to the people who joined us today. Very grateful to you all.
Thanks. Bye.